So good morning, and thank you for coming to this session. The first session here is the Anthropocene, a word that you've heard several times, climate change and wilderness. And we have a tremendous panel here of local folks, plus Marion, to talk about this. But Lori Young, my colleague in the Department of Society and Conservation, will be the moderator. And just so you know who Lori is an Associate Professor of Natural Resource Social Science and the Director of the Resource Conservation Program in the College of Forestry and Conservation at UM. She teaches courses on wildland policy, political ecology, and climate change in society. Her research examines the way communities and public land management agencies navigate and respond to environmental change. Her most current work focuses on how private and public land managers think about the uncertainty in the context of climate change adaptation. And Lori was also the previous director of the Wilderness Institute. So welcome Lori, and she'll introduce the rest of the panelists.
Thank you, Dane. Can you all hear me? Sounds like the mic's on. Great. Okay, well, we have two speakers this morning and two discussants. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. They will both provide about 15, 20-minute presentations. And then we'll have questions and dialogue within the panel, and you'll also have the opportunity to ask questions and join in that dialogue as the audience. And so first, our speakers. Peter Landrus is an ecologist with the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute here in Missoula, Montana. And that's the only federal group that's solely dedicated to wilderness research in the country. Peter has a PhD from Utah State University, and he works daily with managers to help them identify critical wilderness research needs to improve wilderness stewardship. His job is basically to develop the knowledge, strategy, and tools to improve the ecological management of wilderness areas throughout the United States. And he focuses, his current work focuses on managing and monitoring wilderness character, guidelines for scientific activities in wilderness, and helping managers figure out whether to do active ecological restoration in wilderness or take more of a hands-off approach. And our second speaker is Marion Hardequin. She's an associate professor of philosophy and director of the environmental program at Colorado College. She has a PhD in philosophy from Duke University. Many years ago, she was fortunate enough to work here in Montana with Peter and the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. And Marion's current teaching and research focus on environmental philosophy, ethics, and comparative philosophy. And her recent projects include work on the ethics of global climate change and the social and ethical dimensions of ecological restoration in complex landscapes, including former military sites. So Peter and Marion are going to go ahead and present, and then I'll introduce our discussants.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you all for being here this morning on this beautiful and cold morning. I'm going to pose a series of questions to myself, and then I'm going to answer those questions. I'm not using a PowerPoint. This is the first time in about 15 years I have not used a PowerPoint and just have notes, and I'm actually rather nervous about this, not having the visual cues that I'm used to, so please bear with me. To set some context, excuse us. You were not on when you just said that, so I'll repeat what you said. Yeah. So if if at any time anyone can't hear either of us, just please raise your hand, jump up, yell, just to let us know that we're not communicating well with you. Okay. To set context, so the topic this morning is climate change in the Anthropocene, and instead of jumping right into the role of wilderness, what I want to spend just a little time on what is the relationship between climate change and the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is simply a way to describe the pervasive effects of people on our planet. The term was originally coined by an atmospheric chemist in the year 2000, and And what he was trying to do is look at the chemical signature of people starting from about the late 1800s. And this was simply his phrase to say that, yes, people have had this pervasive global influence starting in the industrial age. Now the term is being used somewhat differently. The term is being used as a catch-all for a whole suite of environmental impacts, ranging from habitat fragmentation, the influx of invasive species, water pollutants, air pollutants, the species extinctions, the whole suite of human impacts on the environment. So climate change is merely one component of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is simply a broader concept. So that's just simple context. What I want to do today is spend my time posing and answering 4 questions that relate specifically to the role of wilderness given the climate change and given the reality of the Anthropocene. The first question that I want to pose is wilderness different from other areas that are affected by climate change? Is there something unique and special about wilderness that makes it different from how it is being affected by climate change? The simple answer is no. Wilderness is no different from any other ecological system that's being affected by climate change. Ecological systems, just like in wilderness, are strongly affected by temperature, precipitation, disturbances, and species composition. Climate change affects all of these things, and therefore affects all of these things inside designated wilderness. However, wilderness is radically different from all other areas in something else, in our potential response to climate change. By law, wilderness is unique from all other areas from the legal mandate to be untrammeled, or simply to let nature be, to let nature play out as nature wills, even though nature is under this pervasive influence of climate change and the Anthropocene. So even though climate change is affecting ecological systems in wilderness, and there's no question about that, we have a choice about whether to take action in response to this change. If we decide to take the long view, Donald Worster talked about the long view yesterday and being patient. If we decide to take the long view in wilderness and watch the change that happens, then we also have an opportunity to bear witness to the impacts we're causing to nature, our home. Second question I want to pose: how is wilderness affected by climate change in the Anthropocene? So the first question was asking, is it being affected? The second question is, how is it being affected? To understand this, we need to understand a little more about what wilderness is. Wilderness is broadly composed of 4 interacting, what I'll call, qualities. These 4 qualities are natural, undeveloped, solitude, and untrammeled. Untrammeled was mentioned several times in yesterday's conversation, and I'll talk just a little bit more about it today. As I already described, climate change is directly affecting the natural quality of wilderness, and there's no question about that. Climate change also indirectly affects the other 3 qualities of wilderness, and I'll explain how this is. First, the undeveloped quality. The undeveloped quality in wilderness is degraded by installations and structures. So with climate change, there are increasing calls for the increasing instrumentation of wilderness, putting devices out into the wilderness to measure what is there. Why? Because wilderness is the best natural laboratory that we have. This instrumentation includes such things as weather stations, meteorological stations, water gauging stations, radio collars on wildlife, permanent research sites marked with installations, enclosures, exclosures. In short, a whole bunch of installations are being proposed and are in current wilderness. All of these installations have their positive purposes. They're done for very specific and positive purposes. At the same time, they also degrade the undeveloped quality of wilderness. The second quality of wilderness that I'll talk about is solitude. Solitude is degraded by increasing numbers of people, the impacts of these people, and the managerial reaction to these visitor impacts. As one of the last bastions to provide visitors the opportunity to experience and learn from nature, areas of wilderness close to roads and trails are seeing markedly increased use. Part of this is because of shifting demographics and generational changes as people with seemingly less and less time focus their use in areas that are close to roads and trails. With this increased use comes less solitude because there's simply more people in a smaller area. With greater numbers of people, and these greater numbers of people cause impacts. Has anyone in the room seen toilet paper flowers in wilderness? You know, my daughter and I just spent about 10 days in the Arctic cleaning up. We counted 125 toilet paper flower sites that we cleaned up. So with this increasing use comes needs for increasing management of this use. All of these things, increased use, increased impacts, increased managerial response to either close areas or create or install bathrooms in particular high use areas, all of these decrease the sense of solitude that's such an important part of people feeling connected to and inspired by nature. The third and last quality of wilderness that I'll talk about is the untrammeled quality. With climate change, there are all sorts of calls for increasing calls and pressure to do something, to fix the ecological system, to restore a particular species, or otherwise to manipulate the system in some way to compensate for the effects of climate change and the Anthropocene. While these actions are well intended by most people, these actions put people in charge of deciding what is best for nature. And this directly degrades the untrammeled quality of wilderness. For example, I'm going to run through a bunch of examples. Should we stock non-native fish in wilderness to provide fishing opportunities? We know that recreation fishing is a great source of inspiration for a lot of people in wilderness. Should we stock fish in wilderness lakes to provide these opportunities? Should we stock fish that are native to the region but don't currently occur in the wilderness because the wilderness lakes were de-fished by glacial epochs 11,000 years ago? West Slope cutthroat trout in Montana is a case in point. It's a regionally listed species. It's being threatened. There are proposals to stock West Slope cutthroat trout in wilderness lakes, even though those lakes have not had fish in them for the last 11,000 years. Should we provide artificial water sources for desert ungulates? Desert ungulate populations are suffering from a series of causes, from a series of problems. There are lots of different wilderness units that have provided artificial water. The artificial water sources, in turn, end up bringing animals together that formerly were rather dispersed. We're seeing increased disease rates now in these species. And predators have figured out where the ungulates are now occurring. Gosh, imagine that. Should we reduce predator populations to increase populations of other species for sport hunting? Common occurrence from state fish and wildlife agencies in the Rocky Mountain West. Should we reduce predator populations that take individuals of a species that is listed as threatened or endangered? Interesting case study in the Oregon Islands wilderness managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service, a listed species of common mure, a seabird. With increasing bald eagle populations, bald eagles have been delisted as an endangered species several years ago. Bald eagle populations are increasing throughout the Pacific Northwest, and here's all these seabird eggs sitting around. And common mures are very sensitive to disturbance, so they're being harassed by the bald eagles, the eggs are being eaten, the common mures are abandoning their colonies. There are proposals to reduce populations of bald eagles now. Should we be doing this in designated wilderness? All of these manipulations are being considered for good intentions, and all of them degrade the untrammeled quality of wilderness. As Donald Worster pointed out yesterday, the word pristine is not mentioned in the Wilderness Act. The goal of wilderness is not to maintain particular species. The essential goal is to let nature be, watch and learn what happens. Third question I'd like to pose. Does climate change mean that wilderness no longer exists? Well, assuredly not. Wilderness still exists. Because of the Wilderness Act, we have large areas that are permanently set aside by law. Climate change is definitely affecting the natural quality of wilderness, but it does not alter the existence of wilderness. We now have the opportunity to watch climate change as it plays out in systems that are not intentionally modified or manipulated by human desires and whims. The only thing we need to do now, and this is very hard, is to be patient, take the long view, show humility and restraint in the face of incredibly complex and chaotic forces that we have very little understanding about. And we can also watch and learn from these changes that are occurring. The last question I'd like to pose, and I think this is the key question for this conference, is wilderness an anachronism in the Anthropocene? Is wilderness merely an idea, a concept that had its heyday, had its usefulness, had its purpose long ago, but given the Anthropocene is no longer relevant? My answer is hell no. In fact, because we are in the Anthropocene, wilderness is more relevant and important than ever before. And we have an increased, not decreased, responsibility to protect wilderness and the values and benefits that are derived from wilderness. The first sentence of the Wilderness Act states that wilderness is needed because, and then it lists a whole bunch of things. This is really interesting. Wilderness is needed because of increasing population, and these are quotes from the Wilderness Act, expanding settlement, growing mechanization, the occupation and modification of the United States. Sound familiar today? You bet. This wording was written largely in response to the expanding network of roads and the increasing commodification of nature back then. The wording, I would strongly suggest, is more relevant and important today than even when, in 1964, when the Wilderness Act was passed. We derive many values and benefits from wilderness, and it's important to understand these, to understand the relevance and importance of wilderness in the age of the Anthropocene. There are many different people who have come up with a variety of schemes for categorizing values and benefits. My personal scheme is what I call the 4 E's: ecological, experiential, economic, and ethical values and benefits that we derive. And let me explain a little bit about each. So the ecological value is self-evident. We've been talking about that for a while. Wilderness offers a sanctuary, a place where ecological processes and evolution can unfold without people intentionally determining their course. It's the only place where this happens, by law. What is less evident, and just as important, is the ecological understanding and learning that we can derive from this wilderness. The experiential value is also self-evident. This has been the focus of wilderness recreation for a long, long time. Wilderness offers the opportunities for people to experience the rawness of nature and to be healed by this rawness. Social science literature is filled with examples of the benefits people derive from wilderness experiences. What is less evident and just as important is the opportunity wilderness provides for people to feel connected with something larger than themselves, to feel inspired, to feel enlivened, to feel dependent and interdependent on the larger world of which we're a part. The economic values of wilderness are just now beginning to be understood and quantified. We know the recreation industry generates huge amounts of money, and we're just now figuring out what portion of this $600 billion is generated from wilderness, from people who watch wildlife, people who hunt, from people who fish, and people who simply like to recreate in wilderness. The ethical value of wilderness is perhaps the least evident of all, and in my opinion, perhaps the most important. Most of the speakers at this conference yesterday talked about the ethical value, so I'll be brief. Yesterday, Donald Worster talked about higher altruism. Holmes Ralston talked about three-dimensional people. Christopher Preston talked about an ethical imperative. At its root, at its core, wilderness is about the connection and relationship between people and the land. Howard Zonheiser, the primary author of the Wilderness Act, said it best. He said, quote, "To know the wilderness is to know a profound humility, to recognize one's littleness, to sense dependence and interdependence, indebtedness and responsibility." So, in my view, wilderness always has been fundamentally about ethics, about who we are and our place in nature, about caring for others, about accepting the consequences of our actions and about taking the long view. Few closing thoughts. Because of climate change in the Anthropocene, we have some profound choices that we as a society, as a people, as a culture are now facing. Climate change in the Anthropocene will push or force societal discussion about all of the issues that have been talked about and will be talked about at this conference. I'd suggest that we need to embrace, not shy away from this discussion, because it's an opportunity to have a deeper and more nuanced conversation about the role, value, and benefits of wilderness in our society. Wilderness is the best and most important place to establish and nurture an ethical foundation of wilderness, and we desperately need this for the future. In terms of this ethical imperative, I'd like to suggest that there are three especially important things to think about as we move forward into the era of the Anthropocene. We need to develop and nurture humility and restraint. We need to be guardians, not gardeners. We need to accept the moral responsibility for the havoc we're wreaking on nature. Let me close by simply asking a question and answering it quickly. Is wilderness relevant and important in the Anthropocene and to our future? Hell yes.
All right, thanks a lot, Peter, and it's a real honor and pleasure to be part of this conference and to see faces old and new here in Missoula. So thanks to the organizers for including me. Okay. So I'm an environmental philosopher, and Peter set me up nicely by talking about the importance of ethics in wilderness. And I hope to offer a philosophical perspective on the Anthropocene, climate change, and wilderness today. I'm probably going to end up focusing a bit more on the Anthropocene and wilderness than on climate change specifically, because in some ways, although I'm generally quite worried about climate change, in some ways, I'm more worried about the discourse surrounding the Anthropocene as a threat to wilderness than I am about the impacts of climate change. Because I think, as Peter suggested, if we take the long view, wilderness ecosystems can, in some sense, survive climate change. But whether they can survive the kind of managerial impulse that's being sort of promoted by boosters of the Anthropocene, I think is something we should be worried about. Okay, so philosophers like to talk about concepts, so rather than talking about real people, we like to talk about our concept of persons, and rather than talk about real wilderness, we're sometimes tempted to talk just about our concept of wilderness. But I think the real power of philosophy lies in exploring the way concepts and ideas intersect with actual things, actual lives, and actual institutions. So my hope is to work at that intersection, although I confess I'll probably talk a fair bit about concepts. Before turning to that, I just want to show a couple images. This is that I think have something to say in relation to our concepts of wilderness and the Anthropocene. So this is a picture of the Maroon Bells in the Maroon Bells snowmass wilderness not too far from Aspen. And these are going to be two photos from National Geographic that they did an essay, published an article in 2011 on the Anthropocene, and accompanying that essay were a number of photos. This is a photograph of Dubai, capturing one conception of the Anthropocene. And here are oil fields in California, also capturing a conception of the Anthropocene and what it means for us. Okay, so keep these contrasting images in mind as we move forward. Okay, so I want to suggest that all three concepts on the table today, wilderness, climate change, and the Anthropocene, are bound up with the idea of nature and naturalness in ways that generate conceptual and ethical challenges. All three of these ideas, at least as they're often understood, make implicit or explicit reference to an idea of nature as independent of and unmanipulated by humans. So climate change, I think, implies some kind of natural baseline, the climate as it was or as it would be had it not been influenced by humans. The Anthropocene refers to, as Peter mentioned, a new geologic era in which humans pervasively influence the planet and in which the Earth is no longer natural. People made reference to Bill McKibben as one of the first people who tried to make this point that nature is over. We've reached the end of nature because the human hand is sort of overall. And global climate change is one of the major processes, but not the only one that's purportedly transformed the Earth from a natural to an unnatural or post-natural state. Now, unlike climate change and the Anthropocene, which are set in opposition to the natural, wilderness is supposed to embody the natural. So wilderness refers to land that is supposed to be untrammeled, natural. And even though it's not in the Wilderness Act, I think our conception of wilderness sometimes incorporates the idea of the pristine. The question is, if climate change is transforming the Earth to a new, unnatural state, and if we've entered a new geologic era in which human influence is pervasive, then what is it we're protecting when we are protecting and preserving wilderness? So this is the kind of core question I'd like us to think about. Now, some of those who are convinced that we're living in the Anthropocene suggest that the whole wilderness idea is incoherent given our current circumstances, that wilderness is meant to protect something, nature, that no longer exists. Others hold that the idea of wilderness is inimical to an environmental ethic because the concept of wilderness, as opposed to culture, makes no space for human beings to develop a genuine, positive relationship with the natural world. So under this view, wilderness is elevated and positively valenced, and humans are treated as sullying, fallen, with no hope of redemption. So now if you go to academic conferences, it's sort of refreshing to be here and to see so many people defending the value of wilderness, because at many academic conferences, it's become sort of decidedly uncool to defend wilderness. Well, I'm a philosopher. I'm not that cool anyway, so I'm going to take the uncool position of defending wilderness against these critiques, and even more radically, I want to do so, in part by appealing to the significance of the past. Okay, that's really uncool, right? Because we're a really forward-looking society. We thrive on novelty. We're driven by the thought and the fear that the things we own, the things we think, and even the very persons we are becoming obsolete. And how do we stave off this worry, this fear, this anxiety about obsolescence? Well, we go to the Mac store. We tweet, we try to keep up and to never look back. But what are we losing in being so forward-looking? I think it's worth pausing to reflect. Okay, so let's get back to wilderness. So I can tell you why I think wilderness still matters, even with climate change, even in the Anthropocene. So again, to that central question, what are we protecting when we protect wilderness? Is it mere chimeras, imagined elements of an era gone by? So I was thinking about this question, and I thought, well, let's actually think about chimeras. Okay. So in Greek mythology, a chimera was a mythical beast comprised of a lion, a goat, and a serpent. But I think more importantly for our purposes, the word chimera has two important derivative meanings. It can refer to something imagined, or it can refer to hybrids or mixtures. Now, in the former sense, it's often used disparagingly. So the Oxford Dictionary gives the definition as a thing that is hoped or wished for, but is in fact illusory or impossible to achieve. Now, if wilderness is a chimera in this sense, then it's a mere figment of our imaginations, an unachievable ideal. But why might this be? Well, in the contemporary dialectic, I think that the purported chimerical nature of wilderness in this first sense, as a sort of imagined, illusory ideal, is related to its chimerical nature in the second sense, to wilderness's hybridity. Okay? Now, hybridity, that's academic jargon, but it's basically just about mixtures, about things that don't fall neatly or purely into one category or another. And I think the traditional, at least a traditional conception of wilderness relies on a very sharp boundary. If you were here yesterday for Christopher Preston's talk, he portrayed this boundary between nature and culture as a brick wall, okay? So with this in mind, I think one way of arguing against wilderness in the Anthropocene is this, and we can call this the pessimist argument. So the wilderness concept or wilderness ideal refers to pristine, pure, untarnished land uninfluenced by humans. Wilderness is pure nature. But there are no pristine, pure, untarnished lands uninfluenced by humans. As we all know, there are persistent organic pollutants in the Arctic. Climate change has influenced the atmosphere of the planet as a whole. So there's no pure nature. Well, if these two premises are true, then there's no wilderness, and our concept of wilderness refers to something that's non-existent. So wilderness is a chimera, a figment of our imaginations, an imagined, unattainable ideal. But in thinking about this, I thought, maybe we can turn this argument around. Let's accept that wilderness is a chimera. What then? Do we have to accept the pessimist's conclusion that wilderness is incoherent as a concept and non-existent as an actual thing? So we can accept, I think, actually, that wilderness is a chimera in the first sense, in that it is an ideal, like peace or justice, that may never be fully attainable. And real on-the-ground wilderness, I think, is a chimera in the second sense, in that it always mixes nature with culture, human with wild, non-human animals and people, and so on. Wilderness is a mixture and a hybrid to greater and lesser degrees and in many different ways, and that is actually important, depending on the particular place. So I think that a clear-eyed view of wilderness protection in the 21st century will require acknowledging both of these points. Thus, in protecting wilderness, we're protecting chimeras both in concept and practice. And then, although the Wilderness Society probably shouldn't adopt this as the slogan for their next PR campaign. Okay. So I don't think it's very helpful to stop at this point and just say wilderness is chimerical. I think we need to say more. We need to acknowledge that wilderness is an ideal, but note against the pessimist that ideals can play a genuinely crucial role for us, even if they're never fully attained. And then what we need to do next is inquire into what kind of ideal wilderness is, can, and should be, and what we should do about the unruly fact that real wilderness doesn't quite fit into the idealized conceptual boxes that some have constructed for it. So in moving forward, I think we shouldn't let the controversies over the wilderness concept obscure the reality and the significance of the things that actually occupy wilderness areas. But I think it is worth asking the conceptual question, can we construct an ideal of wilderness that can make sense for an era in which climate change is altering the actual composition of wilderness ecosystems, and in which we can no longer deny all wilderness areas are, in some sense, hybrids? Okay, so to answer this question, I think we need to talk about wilderness as it actually plays a role in human lives, animal lives, and the ongoing functioning of ecological systems. So think about a wilderness area that you've visited, and envision what's there and what it's like to be there. How does that place differ from this place, from New York City or Tokyo or Mumbai? Reflecting on wilderness and my own knowledge and experience of it, here are my own conclusions. Wilderness protects real creatures with real lives that matter to them and to many of us. Wilderness also protects functioning ecological systems, even if these systems change over time as climate changes, and even as these systems are threatened by encroachment by urban development, pollution, and so on. Third, wilderness protects wildness, places where humans are not in total control. And I think, as Peter said a few minutes ago, this is really important in reminding us that humility and receptivity are important virtues. I think this is a particularly important counterpoint to our desire to kind of constantly make and remake the world without necessarily paying attention to what is already existing there that's of value. Fourth, wilderness can play a crucial anchoring role in our lives, and somebody talked about this yesterday in the economics panel at lunchtime. So in playing this anchoring role, wilderness connects us in important ways to nature, to one another, and to the past, and it provides continuity between the past, present, and future. I think one thing that's important to notice is that none of these things requires that wilderness be pristine or that it be completely free of human influence. But the distinctive value of wilderness does depend on some degree of naturalness. It's just that naturalness, I want to suggest, isn't something that once lost is gone forever. So we don't have to have this idea that once you cross to the other side of the wall, somehow there's no going back. So I want to give a few examples now, not of designated wilderness, but of wild places that exemplify hybrid chimerical nature, and that maybe can be instructive to us as we consider how to go on conceiving wilderness in the Anthropocene. Okay, so this is going to look familiar if you were here yesterday. It's a picture of Oostvaardersplassen in the Netherlands, not too far from Amsterdam. And as Christopher Preston pointed out, this is one example of a kind of broader European and in this case Dutch specifically effort to rewild places that have been influenced by human beings for a long time, and to develop new nature, what's called new nature. Now, Oostvaardersplassen is particularly interesting because this place wouldn't exist in anything like this form if it wasn't for human beings. This is land that's been reclaimed from the sea. It was slated for development, but at some point it began to be colonized by lots of wetland birds, and its sort of natural qualities started to kind of rise up and become apparent, and they decided to actually transform it into basically a nature preserve, to introduce proxies for historic grazing animals that are now extinct. And my husband and I visited this place, and it's a genuinely wild place. I mean, it's not the Bob Marshall wilderness, but it's a really fascinating, interesting wild place. So I think the lesson from a place like this is that wildness and wilderness can emerge from human-created lands and from anthropogenic processes. But obviously, this place is radically different than it would have been had it been turned into housing developments. So there's something about the kind of human intervention here that's important. Okay. The second place is a place that's close to home, not too far from home for me, and where I've spent a fair bit of time in recent years. It doesn't look like this anymore, but not too far from Denver and the old Stapleton Airport is an old chemical weapons manufacturing plant called the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, now the Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge. This was a place that produced basically all the nasty chemical weapons that the U.S. ever made, nerve gas, VX, sarin bomblets, all sorts of stuff. It started in the 40s. In the 1990s, early 1990s, it looked like this. You can see very industrial. But they decided to decommission and remediate, and so this is sort of how it looked in the process of decommissioning, taking down the water tank, scraping away all those buildings. And today, all the buildings, pretty much, most of them, are gone. And it's been turned into a national wildlife refuge. And this is a place where they've reintroduced bison, where bald eagles live, burrowing owls, thousands of prairie dogs, many wetland birds. And they have a large-scale grassland, mixed grass, and short grass prairie restoration program. So I think, and this is not to gloss over the fact that there's still remaining contamination, and it's a very complex place with a very layered history. But I think one of the important lessons from this site is that wildness and wilderness, at least a form of wilderness, can exist in sites and return to sites that have these very complex socio-ecological histories, places that 20 years ago or 25 years ago, you never would have guessed could have hosted a herd of bison. Okay, so, I think what I want to suggest is that these places highlight the possibility of wildness even in the face of this hybridity. Now, but I want to contrast these places with a place like this, the Disney Wilderness Lodge. Eric Higgs, whom some of you I think know, has written about this place. And I think Albert Borgman might have something to say about it too, as something much more virtual, less real, as kind of simulacrum of wilderness. And this place is, I think, deeply ironic. If you go to their website, they say, so this is in South Florida, right? Escape to the rustic majesty of America's great Northwest, right? Soak in the splendor of the great outdoors, from nature trails through pine forests to rocking chairs that overlook a murmuring creek. Inside, discover towering totem poles, headdresses, and more, and sink into a plush leather armchair in front of a roaring fireplace. Okay, so there you go. So I think one of the important things for us in the Anthropocene and in acknowledging hybridity is that we still need to be able to tell the difference between places like Ostvardersplassen and Rocky Mountain Arsenal and places, on the one hand, and places like Disney Wilderness Lodge on the other. So wilderness in the Anthropocene challenges us to make the crucial distinctions, but also to allow, where needed, transgressions of previously static and sharp categories. So in my view, wilderness in the Anthropocene provides an important space for us to consider the old in a new way, to value relations, connections, and ideals that are enduring, yet while allowing for their evolution and reinterpretation. And I think, echoing something Peter said, this really requires facing wilderness's prejudices and limitations rather than turning away from them. So it demands that we not give up on wilderness, even in the Anthropocene. So kind of to wrap up, I want to say that wilderness adds relief and topography to our experience. Just as churches, synagogues, or mosques provide a space that is distinctive, embedded in yet set apart from the mundane and profane aspects of our daily lives, and in the same way that holidays, birthdays, and reading stories to children at bedtime encourage us to pause and attend to what we really cherish and value. I think the danger of the Anthropocene, which kind of quickly slides from a descriptive characterization of the world into a prescription for planetary management, is that it'll flatten out that texture, and that we'll learn from the Anthropocene just what this New Yorker cartoon advises a father to son: as you go through life, don't forget to monetize the roses. Now, I'm not saying that we don't need economics, or that we can't employ the idea of ecosystem services to quantify in certain contexts the value that wilderness or nature provides to us. But I think it would be a real shame if that was the only lens that we were able to deploy in thinking about wilderness. So, in conclusion, critics are mistaken in thinking of the ideal of wilderness as an ideal we were meant to apply everywhere. That would be like saying that because churches are good, all spaces should be transformed into churches, or because holidays are good, every day should be a holiday. We don't actually need wilderness everywhere, and we don't need to judge every place and space in relation to the wilderness ideal. But there are things we can learn from wilderness: humility, receptivity, a connection to the past, and continuity, even in the Anthropocene, that we still need to know. So I hope that this boundary will continue to mark and demarcate an important place in our lives. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter and Marion. Those were wonderful talks to get us started on this really interesting and complex topic. I'm going to introduce our two discussants now, and these are Pat Burke and Kara Nelson. Pat has a master's degree in forest ecology and philosophy from the University of Montana. He currently teaches in the philosophy department in the Davidson Honors College here on campus and in the field with the Wild Rockies Field Institute. His work focuses on environmental ethics, in particular climate change ethics, as well as the philosophy of technology. He worked as a wilderness ranger and a trail crew foreman for 8 years in the Anaconda Pintler and Selway Bitterroot wildernesses. He says this was the pinnacle of his professional life. He was also the founder and president of Bitterroot Restoration Incorporated for 20 years. And Karen Nelson is an associate professor in the Ecosystem and Conservation Sciences Department here at the University of Montana. She also directs the Ecological Restoration Program here and chairs the International Society for Ecological Restoration. She has a PhD in forest ecosystem analysis from the University of Washington. And when she's not attempting to answer all of her emails, her research focuses on ecological processes and their application to restoration of terrestrial ecosystems. And more specifically, she and her students look at ecosystem responses to disturbance, the efficacy of and ecological impacts of restoration treatments, and the conceptual basis for ecological restoration. So our discussants are going to pose a series of questions for Peter and Marion, our speakers, and we'll have some dialogue where they get to respond, and then we respond, and then we'll also invite you to respond to the topics that are brought up by the panel. And then at the end of the session, if we have some time, you can raise additional questions that haven't been covered or additional topics that haven't been covered yet. So, Pat, everyone has their microphone on, right?
I think so.
Great.
Okay. Well, for either Marion or Peter here, there's been a lot of discussion at this wilderness conference about the ethical imperative of wilderness. And one way to think about that is that we as humans have an ethical imperative to care for, to preserve, perhaps even to manage wild areas that still remain. However, I'm interested in whether you see the experience of wilderness as teaching us, as human beings, something of ethical importance. Does it teach us something about how we should perhaps speak and act, how we should actually live in the Anthropocene? Is there something specific that it might teach us about kind of our responsibility in our lives in the Anthropocene?
Go ahead, I was just talking.
Yes. Yeah, the answer is yes. Yeah, I think Marion and I both touched on this pretty strongly. One of the things that I think it's easy for us to do is, because wilderness is right now relatively away from most people's daily lives, because we're in a room like this, we're in our homes, we don't see it. And so one of the things that I think it's easy to do is sweep the impacts to wilderness under the rug, under the proverbial rug. And that's why one of the things that I was trying to highlight in my comments it's a place where we need to and can accept responsibility for our actions. So it's easy to say, gosh, we're losing species. But to be able to actually honor, and this is going to sound weird and probably brutal, but to honor that loss of species in designated wilderness and accept our moral responsibility for that. I think that's huge, to recognize it, not sweep it under the rug. So basically accept consequences of our actions, both personally, and everybody who's been in wilderness knows that when you're in a wilderness, you take direct responsibility for your actions in the short term. Whether it's walking, when you see a grizzly bear, we have an opportunity to take action and accept responsibility in a very quick moment of time. And the moral side is a longer view for accepting that responsibility. So I think those are direct, tangible things that we can do right now.
Yeah, and I guess I'd just briefly add, I would affirm everything that Peter says, and also say that I think sometimes people, thinking about wilderness in this kind of dichotomous way, criticize wilderness as a kind of escapist ideal, right? It's like where we sort of go to escape the terrible city and all the bads that are there. And I think we can see wilderness as a place where we go to have some distance from other parts of our lives without seeing it as escapist in a problematic way. I mean, so I think one thing that wilderness can allow us to do, which we can do in other ways as well, but is to gain reflective distance on our lives. So to step back for a moment, and the contrast, I think, can be really instructive. The contrast in the pacing of our lives, the contrast in the actual physical setting and how it differs from the physical setting in which, most of us spend many of our days. And so there are important aspects, I think, as Holmes Ralston, he's here somewhere, pointed out yesterday, the urban, rural, and wild are all sort of important aspects of being three-dimensional persons, and wilderness occupies one place that allows us to sort of understand how we might be in ways that are sometimes backgrounded in our urban existence.
Yeah, I'd agree. That both it instructs us on taking responsibility for what we're doing in the Anthropocene, and it also perhaps gives us that distance from our everyday lives that will allow us to question them. But I wondered also if like in a really positive sense, it might give us indications of an alternative conception of the good life. I think, following with what Albert Borgman has said, our contemporary implicit conception of the good life is kind of one of hyperconsumption, and whether there's some kind of contribution to our understanding, a positive understanding, an alternative understanding of what that good life might be from that experience of wilderness.
If I can add just a quick comment on that, Holmes Ralston mentioned it yesterday, the others. One of the things that as we pause and take stock of how wilderness is different from our day-to-day hecticness, that it is a place where we can sit back and reflect. And the phrase that I try to use, but it's not very accurate, is that can we evolve and develop as human beings? And what does that include? Not physically, but culturally. And I think it expands our conception of self to others. And that is a really good thing. And wilderness as a place apart could be a part of all of our daily conceptions of who we are. But it's going to take effort.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like that direct experiential connection with other living things is pretty crucial, and something I think people talked about the last child. Well, Holmes again talked about sort of the last child in the woods. I mean, I think that direct connection, it makes vivid what we're losing. But I also think, I mean, anyone I think who's spent time backpacking in wilderness would say that it does call your attention to what's most fundamental. Like, what do you need to exist on a day-to-day basis, and what don't we need?
Right. And how little we actually need to be happy in some kind of fundamental way. And perhaps it also, for me anyway, it sometimes challenges the language that I use in speaking about the natural world, kind of this pervasive resource language which we use that seems somehow completely inappropriate when you're out there.
Oh, does the audience have anything that you want to contribute to this part of the conversation? We're going to shift gears to a different theme, but if there's anything you want to ask or say about this piece of the discussion, please let us know.
Yeah, Lori, do we need a microphone up front, or do we not need that?
There's one coming.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, so I'll switch gears now and ask Peter about the untrammeled nature of wilderness as an inherent property of wilderness, or a characteristic. You mentioned 4. And you also highlighted, I thought very effectively, how management actions affect that untrammeled nature of wilderness. And, we see the debate centering around, can we afford not to manage in wilderness? For instance, some of you may have seen the New York Times article from July, Rethinking the Wild, the Wilderness Act is facing a midlife crisis. And this article really centered around the idea that we can't afford not to manage wilderness. The assumption, of course, is that we can effectively manage wilderness to obtain the intended effects that we want. So my question to you, Peter, is how much do we know about the efficacy and ecological effects of the management actions that we're taking in wilderness?
Not much. And I think Marion said it more succinctly than I did when she said that with the big concern is with the Anthropocene close on our heels or in the midst of it, is that the managerial mindset is to do things. That is what managers are hired to do, is to do things. And in wilderness, it flips it all around. And so managers are never, and I don't mean to speak for the managerial community because my job is as a scientist, but I do interact with managers pretty almost on a daily basis, so I think I can speak somewhat, is that in a performance review, managers are not graded on how much they have not done. And in wilderness, that should be the default position. And so the question that you're asking, Kara, gets right into how much information do we need to be able to take action within wilderness? And so it's not a single level playing field. Every place is very different from one another. It is highly situational dependent. The example that I raised with the common mure seabird that's on listed species status, being threatened by bald eagles. So do we know enough about bald eagle interactions with common mure to be able to reduce bald eagle populations? I have no idea. I mean, I honestly don't. What scares me is the presumption of adequate knowledge, and I think of how many times, dozens, if not hundreds of times, that we have taken action with absolutely the best of intentions. Absolute, no question about it. Classic example is DDT. The Swiss chemist who invented DDT was awarded the Nobel Prize in, I think it was chemistry, because DDT was developed as an anti-malarial thing to control malaria. It was a great thing at the time, but now only after did we learn all of the unintended consequences. So my fear in wilderness is that, like Marion said, we have this complex topography of land management categories. And if we want to do experiments based on our lack of sufficient knowledge, let's do that outside of wilderness. And when we are confident that we have sufficient knowledge, and I don't know what that means, sufficient knowledge, but when we're confident enough to take action in wilderness, and the need is high enough in wilderness, and I think for listed species and threatened and endangered species, changes that playing field and increases the need for action, then let's go do that. But we need to be operating with the basis of profound humility and restraint. Marion, do you want to add anything?
I mean, I think the only thing that I'd add is that that wilderness management is actually a distinctive form of management, right? So this idea of using the minimum tool, trying to restrain the type of management and the way in which we engage management in wilderness, that's really important. I mean, I think that's really important in retaining a sense of possibility in our approach to management more broadly. So I think there are lessons there for thinking about management doesn't have to be putting things exactly where we want them all the time. So I think wilderness can be an important model in that sense.
Yeah, great responses, and I really agree with both of you that wilderness management and restoration should be viewed as something different when it's occurring in wilderness areas than elsewhere on the landscape. In terms of understanding uncertainty, of course we want to do that everywhere, but maybe doing less experimentation and more evidence-based management in wilderness, and doing a better job of highlighting the uncertainty and learning as we go from our management interventions. There's something else that's been really bothering me, however. For instance, in the New York Times article, and if for those of you who haven't seen it, it's a really interesting read, and that is about the goals of management interventions. The article talked about whether it would be possible to maintain tree species in wilderness, sequoias, et cetera, in their current locations. And the assumption there is that the goal of ecological restoration is to hold the world constant at some previous point in time. And that we would be doing our jobs as managers if wilderness areas 200 years from now look exactly as they do today, 400 years from now, 1,000 years from now. Well, of course, for anyone who studies ecology, an inherent property of ecosystems is that they change. And so it doesn't make sense in terms of goals for ecological restoration to try to maintain the landscape at any past point in time. Rather, the goal of restoration is to remove degradation and to allow the system to recover to the state that it would have been in if it hadn't have been degraded. And that's something that I've seen has been really missing from the debate surrounding management goals. So in some places, it's appropriate, I think, to talk about removing degradation using evidence-based management. But it's an entirely different question to talk about maintaining historic conditions on the landscape, because culturally we have a fidelity to the systems that we grew up with and the kinds of landscapes that we like. So not really a question, but if anyone would like to comment or in the audience would like to comment.
Well, my first comment is amen. Well said. But I didn't hear the word process. I heard it a few times, but not as much as I thought I might. We're not preserving wilderness as museum, wilderness as 1492, but we want dynamic processes in place. And in that sense, we manage, if you like, to restore, but not to restore to a previous state, but rather to restore ongoing dynamic processes. Maybe hands off. We manage to keep these natural processes functioning. Now, in that sense, you might say what we want to do is move to global levels exactly what we're doing in wilderness, to manage in such way that the earth keeps its ongoing dynamic processes. Life is a marvelous thing. Life has existed in all the sorts of climates between equator and poles. Life figures out how to continue in very diverse environments. Yes, the climate change is going to produce differences, and some things can adapt easily, they migrate. Some things can't adapt easily. They are trees whose seeds do not travel far. But climate change is not likely to give us a world that exceeds the extremes from Arctic to poles. And life has existed in all those kinds of diverse environments, and it's likely that life can continue to exist in dynamic ways in any sorts of environments, I think, that we can foresee.
Can I add just one thought? Yeah, so in one of the things that we're trying to articulate, Holmes, is in wilderness, of all places, the goal is to allow evolution to be unfettered by human drives and desires. Simply put, process.
Peter, I'd respond to that and say, aren't we kind of looking at this notion of that we're in wilderness, we do not manipulate it with blinders on, because in fact with the Anthropocene, global climate change, we are actually in fact manipulating all wilderness areas everywhere on the earth. And so to say, well, we're going to maintain the untrammeled character of the wilderness is to kind of take a some people have told me, well, we just have to grow up and acknowledge our responsibility for what we're doing out there and take charge because, in fact, we are changing everything. So we have this responsibility to start to manage everything. And how do you guys respond?
Let me respond, but let's let Holmes.
What are you managing for? Once again, you may manage to keep the biosphere providing the life support system that the planet continues. These global managers are not likely to replace photosynthesis as a basic sort of life process, for example. They're going to want to manage to keep the life support system going. Now, I do think you can't think in long-term evolutionary systems. I doubt that there will be in the future the evolution of new forms of mammals. I think we've gotten past that stage on the planet. We have to accept that. There are the evolution of new life forms, but probably some forms of evolution will be shut down by the human presence on the planet.
Exactly. Let me respond to Pat. Pat, what you articulated very well is a really common misperception, I think, and so let me just put it out there, and then we have several other people who want to talk. So one of the key elements of the untrammeledness of nature is that there's an implication of intentionality behind that. So global climate change is pervasive. It's global. It's regional. Even before we had the word Anthropocene, invasive non-native species were spreading all over the place. Not by intentionality, but by what was happening. So what we have a choice in wilderness is to let the area be and accept that there are these pervasive changes that are going on, and it's about our choices for the future. What choices we as the management and scientific community choose to take for the future, accepting that these areas are definitely affected by global and regional effects.
This goes back to that kind of original question and your answer, Peter. You sound like a scientist in your answer. I mean, in that you say that we should be doing these experiments not in nature, doing them in a lab or whatever, to figure out enough information until we have some critical mass of knowledge about ecological systems before we start trying to manage them. And to me, that kind of makes sense in my scientific brain too, that like I feel like there should be some baseline that we need to know this much. But I mean, isn't that kind of the whole big ethical question is like, because I would think maybe some people argue right now we know enough, and maybe 5 years from now we'll know more, and then people will argue that that's enough, but there will also be people who are saying that's not enough. I guess my question is just, do you feel like there is some level that, not that you know it right now, but there is a level that we just have to get to that point before we can start managing things, or will it always be like kind of ambiguous?
Great question. Yeah, super question. Yeah, there is well, we'll never have enough information. I mean, this is kind of the paradox of science. I am a scientist. I work for the U.S. Forest Service, Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute as a scientist. So yes, bona fide. But is our decisions driven by science? No, they're not. Science is one component of a complex set of factors that drive decisions. Is science important? Yes. Will we ever have sufficient knowledge? No. So what we're doing, and Kara was involved, and there's several other people in this room have been involved, what the Leopold Institute is trying to do is lay these dimensions out on a table so we can have an explicit discussion about them. So what drives decisions? Law and policy, science, resources, money and staff, and values. So we're trying to tease these things apart and to be able to say, here is what is sufficient information, and if so, then let's now explicitly deal with the values parts. Because the concern right now, what we're seeing in the wilderness community and in the scientific community, is that values are having an inordinate influence on driving the decisions without recognizing how much science do we have. Kara's question was, how much information do we have about restoration efficacy? In many cases, we have some information, and then people are taking that and running with it. In other cases, we have restoration actions that have occurred in some place and then being applied in an area that's totally different. Context matters. So really good question, and I'd say we're in the middle of trying to tease that, all those elements out, and to be explicit about it. Marion, did you have anything else you want to add to that?
No, I was just going to, I mean, something small was that, I mean, I think what I understood Peter to be saying in part is that maybe that not necessarily do we have to do all our experimentation in the lab, which ecologically is probably unrealistic, but maybe there are other types of lands outside of wilderness that would be more appropriate sites for experimentation. And I think, I mean, this is something that's being refined, but the whole idea of adaptive management where we try something out, you know, maybe on a small scale, we look at what happens, we evaluate the results, and then we kind of recursively go back and adjust our management. I mean, that has the potential, interpreted in a certain way, to be a sort of management with humility, because it doesn't assume in advance that we know precisely what the outcomes will be.
Let me offer...
I want to add just one thing as someone who works on studying the efficacy and effects of restoration treatments along with my students. And my entire career in this area has been one of thinking, I must be wrong. Because for so many management actions that we take, we really have very, very little information. And in some cases, not even a single study that's been done anywhere in support of what we're doing. So for some types of activities, we have strong evidence. But for much of what we're doing on the landscape, we have very, very limited evidence, clearly not across that bar on the low side of the gradient. And it's been fascinating to me to see the piece about how, the piece that's missing uncertainty, you know, in the conversation.
I met with the author of that New York Times piece when he was working on it, and you find no more classic case of an author a reporter who came to his subject with his mind made up, and I could not dissuade him. And to me, the lesson that I drew from that, and I thought it was a terrible article, created a completely false idea, as you all have been discussing, is that it suggested that somehow or other we could somehow keep these wilderness areas, large and small, as islands protected from the impact of global climate change, which of course is ludicrous. And to me, the defeat in that is that it disarms people from saying we've got to tackle the issue of global climate change as a whole, and one benefit of doing that will be to protect our wilderness areas if we can succeed down the line, let alone survive as a planet. So, thanks.
I couldn't be here yesterday afternoon because I had to moderate the student faculty seminar of the Presidential Lecture Series and the Philosophy Forum. And on that occasion, Alan Wolf gave this wonderful presentation titled, Why Diaspora is Good for the Jews. And I thought he was talking about the same thing as Marion. And the point of his talk was that there's what he calls the lachrymose history of the Jews. It's all over. So that was the pessimist view that Marion presented. And he thought that there's much material now to support the lachrymose view because the certain events that were thought to be crucial for the identity of Jewish identity are receding into the past. The Holocaust, the founding of the State of Israel. He didn't talk about the long ago disappearance of the shtetls and these communities. And he, in the face of all this, he says, no, things are good. And pointed out that there's a new vibrant literature written by the next generation, the current generation of young Jewish people, that the fact that they intermarry a lot with Gentiles has not led to the end of their celebrations and the character of their families. And that's what Marion said about the wilderness, that yeah, these old truths are gone, but new horizons open up. And that connects to a point that Pat made, and that is, if you accept what Marion says, and I do, and you take up the challenge that Pat posed, and I think that we should accept, then one thing that should be done in addition to all the wonderful things that have been done here with this impressive subtlety of insight and distinctions is make connections to the rest of the culture to see that what Alan Wolfe is talking about and this wonderful optimism combined with profound knowledge of what's going on applies to the wilderness, you know, and it applies to people trying to recover and reconstitute all kinds of the most hopeful things in the culture. So perhaps saying why the Anthropocene is good for the wilderness is a little strong, but I think we should at least keep that in mind.
Thank you, Albert. So we only have a few more minutes, unfortunately, and I see there are a lot of people who would like to say something. So if you all could say something very quickly, and then I'm going to give all the panelists one more opportunity to say any very brief closing comments.
I'll keep it very short. I was wondering about a very specific question related to that earlier comment, can we afford not to manage? And that's fire, particularly on our western forests. And particularly the fact that with fire, we have such high fuel loads in our western forests because of beetle kill, because of climate change. And of course, if a fire gets hot enough and big enough, it's not going to, we won't be able to stop it. And so is that a specific question that we need to address, that fuel loads could get to the point where we could sterilize the soil in sensitive areas? I just would be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think we have a pervasive view across the West that we have issues with fire that extend across all forest ecosystems. And while it's true that some of our forest ecosystems, maybe about a quarter of the 13 western states, are characterized by frequent low-severity fire, and high-severity fire in those systems is truly a threat. For many of our wilderness areas, they're at higher elevation with other types of forests characterized by high-severity fire, low-frequency, high-severity fire. So for those systems, you could consider the risk of catastrophic fire as much less than areas outside of the wilderness landscape. And that's not entirely true, and Peter, I'll ask you to add your comments, because I'm not sure the distribution of forest types across wilderness areas, but it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I want to make just a general comment and not go into any detail at all. Yeah, fire has been a huge issue. It's one of the issues that propelled this whole discussion about what are the goals of managing wilderness. And there are several people in the room, Dave Parsons, Dave Campbell in particular, and there's probably others, who started this discussion in the early 1970s. And so the whole notion of fire, the role of fire, gets back also to what Kara said really earlier, is stop the threats. Well, you know, the suppressing fire is a threat, you know, to these systems. So this discussion has been ongoing in wilderness for a long time. Do we have all the answers? No. Do fire scientists and fire managers, there's a huge amount of resources. I keep looking at all the resources that the fire community has and saying, God, why don't you guys have this figured out by now? Jeez, you know. But the intensity of fire, the loss of property, the loss of fire ramps everything up. So the quick answer to your question is absolutely. Absolutely, in all of the ways that you phrased it.
So we are officially out of time, but I want to give Marion and Pat a chance to say anything in closing, and then Peter and Kara too. Okay, well, I want to thank all of our panelists for their contributions to the discussion, and thank all of you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to take all of your questions and comments. Obviously, we could have talked about this for another hour. It's a really interesting and relevant topic, and so thank you, everyone.